The Russian Revolution became almost as important as the First World War in its influence on later 20th century events and global conflicts. Although the War of 1914 and 1918 was one of the decisive, short term causes of the revolution, the far reaching upheaval came also from numerous other social and political problems in Russian society. And the revolutionary ideas of the Bolshevik Party attracted followers far beyond Russia itself. The Russian Revolution of 1917 can thus be compared in its historical magnitude with the French Revolution of 1789. Both originated in deep-lying and distant causes, and both made their repercussions felt in many countries for many years. The present chapter will examine the revolutionary process in Russia over half a century. We begin with a brief overview of the old regime before 1900, pass through the two revolutions of 1905 and 1917, and survey the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics down to 1939, at which time a new order had been consolidated under Joseph Stalin. A form of planned economy had been realized, and the last of the original revolutionaries, or old Bolsheviks, either had been silenced or put to death. The comparison of the Russian Revolution to the French is enlightening in many ways. Both claim to be movements of liberation, the one against feudalism and despotism, the other against capitalism and imperialism. Neither was a strictly national movement dealing with merely domestic troubles. Both claimed a universal historical significance and addressed their message to all the world. Both overthrew traditional monarchies, passed through phases of increasing radicalism, and attracted followers and critics in all countries. Both aroused a strong reaction on the part of those whose view of life was endangered. And both showed the same pattern of revolutionary politics, a relative unity of opinion so long as the problem was to overthrow the old regime, followed by disunity and conflict over the founding of the new, so that one set of revolutionaries eliminated others, until a small 13-1-8-7-4-9 organized and determined minority, Jacobin Democrats in 1793, Bolshevik communists in 1918, suppressed all opposition in order to defend or advance the revolutionary cause. And in short order, within a matter of months in France, years in Russia, many of the most intensely revolutionary leaders were themselves suppressed or liquidated. French and Russian revolutions. The differences are equally deserving of notice. Relatively speaking, or compared by many criteria with other European societies, Russia in 1900 was among the least advanced countries, and France in 1780 in many ways was in the lead. The main strength of the French Revolution lay in the middle classes, who soon managed to prevail over more extreme pressures from lower-class activists. In the Russian Revolution, middle-class people were also active, especially at first, but they proved unable to cope with mass discontents and succumbed to a more radical party that appealed to workers and peasants. In France, the revolution just happened, so to speak, in that ordinary people from many walks of life unexpectedly found themselves in a revolutionary situation. And even the Jacobin dictatorship was improvised by individuals who had spent their lives thinking of other things. In Russia, professional revolutionaries worked for the revolution long in advance, and the dictatorship of the Bolsheviks realized the plans and preparations of 20 years. In France, the revolution was followed by a reaction in which émigrés returned, dispossessed classes reappeared in politics, and even the Bourbons were restored. The French Revolution was followed by a century of uneasy compromise. The Russian Revolution effectively wiped out its opposition. Few émigrés returned. No Romanovs regained their throne. The Russian Revolution was in this sense more immediately successful. But in the long run, other significant differences reemerged. By the 1990s, the ideas proclaimed in Russia in 1917 were in ruins, while 13 and 19th, those proclaimed in France in 1789, were widely accepted. Representative constitutional government, equal civil rights under national sovereignty, and legal safeguards for persons and property. The repercussions of the Russian Revolution were felt widely around the world because of Russia's special position in global politics and economic affairs. Since the days of Peter the Great and before, it had always faced toward both Europe and Asia. It was European, Yet it was also outside Europe and even opposed to it. If about 1900, it was the least developed of the major European countries, it was at the same time one of the most developed, industrialized, or modernized parts of the world outside the inner zone of European nations. Its revolution could win sympathy on the left in Europe because it reinforced the old European socialist objections to capitalism. It aroused the interests of peoples in other continents because it also denounced economic imperialism and the possession of colonies by Europeans, affirming that imperialism was merely the highest stage of capitalism and that both must be overthrown together. The Soviet Union, once established, came to occupy an intermediate position between Europe and the colonial world, or what later came to be called the Third World. In Europe and America, it would long be feared or admired as the last word in social revolution. In the colonial or formerly colonial world, it suggested new beginnings, a new way to become modern without being capitalistic or Western, a step in a worldwide rebellion against Europe's imperial ascendancy. The Russian Revolution thus not only produced communism and a fascist reaction in Europe, but also added strength to the emerging anti-colonial movements in Asia and elsewhere. Repercussions of the revolution in Russia. Although professional revolutionaries worked for revolution in Russia, they did not cause it. Lenin and the Bolsheviks did not bring about the Russian Revolution. They captured it after it had begun. They boarded the 1320 ship in midstream. The Russian Revolution, like all great revolutions, originated in many strands of previous history, in diverse local causes, and in the prolonged dissatisfaction of many kinds of people. 750-87. Backgrounds. Russia, Air, 1881. Reaction and progress. We have seen in earlier chapters how the Tsarist autocracy ruled as a machine superimposed upon its subjects, how the upper class became increasingly connected with Western European cultures, while the masses sank further into serfdom, how a developing intelligentsia was divorced both from the work of government and the activities of the people, and how Alexander II freed the serfs in 1861 and created provincial and district councils, or zemstvos. In 1881, Alexander II was assassinated by members of the revolutionary group called the People's Will. His son, Alexander III, 1881 to 1894, tried to stamp out revolutionism and to silence even peaceable criticism of the government. Revolutionaries and terrorists were driven into exile. Jews were subjected to pogroms, by far the worst of any until then, in modern times. For the first time, the empire adopted a program of systematic Russification. Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, the peoples of the Caucasus, the scattered German communities, the Muslim groups in Central Asia, all faced the prospect of forcible assimilation to Russian culture. The philosopher and chief official of this movement was Pobyedonostsev, procurator of the Holy Synod, or layman head of the Russian Orthodox Church, who wanted a disciplined clergy to protect the faithful from insidious European influences. Russification in the old regime. 1321. This is not, however, what happened. In the closing decades of the 19th century, Russia became more than ever before a part of European civilization. Almost overnight, it presented Europe with great works of literature and music that Europeans could appreciate. The 19th century Russian novel became known throughout the Western world. All could read the novels of Tolstoy, 1828 to 1910, without a feeling of strangeness. And if characters in the novels of Turgenev, 1818-1883, and of Dostoevsky, 1821 to 1881, behaved more strangely, the authors themselves were obviously within the broad European cultural traditions and debates. The melodies of Tchaikovsky, 1840 to 1893, and of Rimsky-Korsakov, 1844-1908, became familiar throughout Europe and America. If they sometimes seemed hauntingly wild, distant, or sad, they still betrayed no more than the usual amount of national idiosyncrasy. Russians also contributed to the sciences, notably chemistry, physics, and higher mathematics, and Russia produced internationally acclaimed chess players. Russia also, from the 1880s, began to pass through the Industrial Revolution and take its place as an integral part of the world economic system. European capital entered the country, financing railways, mines, and factories, as well as government and the army, until by 1914, Europeans had about the same amount invested in Russia as in the United States, some $4 billion in each case. In 1897, under the reforming ministry of Count Witt, Russia adopted the gold standard, making its currency readily convertible with all others. In the quarter century between 1888 and 1913, the Russian railway mileage more than doubled, the miles of telegraph wires multiplied fivefold, the number of post offices trebled, and the number of letters carried by the mails multiplied 7 times. Industrialization before 1914. Although still industrially undeveloped by European standards, Russia was industrializing rapidly. Exports rose in value from 400 million rubles in 1880 to 1.6 billion in 1913. Imports, though smaller, grew more 30-22 rapidly, quintupling in the same period. They consisted of such items as tea and coffee and of the machines and industrial goods made in Western Europe. 751 industrialization, in Russia as in all countries, brought an increase both of the business and of the wage-earning classes. Though growing, they were still not numerous by comparison to similar social classes in the more industrialized nations. Factory workers, laboring for 11 or more hours a day for low wages under hard conditions, were in somewhat the same position as in England or France before 1850. Unions were illegal and strikes were prohibited. Russian workers were heavily concentrated in larger industries, however, and half of all industrial workers were employed in factories employing over 500 persons. It was easier for workers under such circumstances to be organized economically and at the proper time to be mobilized politically. As for the Russian business and capitalist class, it was relatively the weaker because of several features in the situation. Ownership of much of Russia's new industrial plant was in foreign hands. Much was owned by the Tsarist government itself. Russia already had the largest state-operated economic system in the world. Moreover, the Russian government itself borrowed heavily from Europe. Hence, it was less dependent financially on its own people and more able to maintain an absolutist regime. Nevertheless, the rising business and professional classes, reinforced by enterprising landowners, were strong enough to form a liberal segment of public opinion, which emerged in 1905 as the Constitutional Democratic Party, or Cadets. Many of those who were active in the provincial Zemstvos also became constitutional Democrats. They were liberals, progressives, or constitutionalists in the Western European sense, thinking less about the troubles of factory workers and peasants than about the need for a nationally elected parliament to control the policies of state. The Cadets' 1323 Russia remained predominantly agricultural. Its huge exports were mainly farm and forest products. The peasants formed 4/5 of the population. Free from their former lords since 1861, they lived in village communes called mirs. In most communes, much of the land was divided and redivided among peasant households by agreement of the village community, nor could anyone leave without communal permission. Until 1906, the peasants continued to pay redemption money arising from the emancipation of 1861, and they paid other onerous fees even after the redemption payments ended. They also paid high taxes, for the government defrayed the interest on its foreign loans from taxes raised at home. The constantly rising export of cereals, also used to pay off Russia's foreign debts, tended to keep food from the farmer's table. Many peasants raised the best wheat for sale and ate black bread themselves. The farm population, in short, as in other countries in similar stages of their development, bore a considerable share of the costs of industrialization. Under such pressures, and because of their crude methods of cultivation, the peasants were forever demanding more land. Land hunger was felt both by individual families and by the mirs. The emancipation had turned over roughly half the land to peasant ownership, individual and collective, and in the following half-century, the peasants added to their share by buying from non-peasant owners. The mirs were by no means obsolescent. They were, in fact, flourishing. They acquired far more land by purchase than did individual buyers, and perhaps half or more of the peasants valued communal security above the uncertain pleasures of private property. The exceptions were the minority of more enterprising and wealthier peasants, later called the kulaks, whom the most impoverished peasants often disliked. Peasant demands. The emergence of revolutionary parties 1324. After the emancipation in 1861, many peasants continued to believe that they had some kind of rights in all the land of former estates on which they had formerly been serfs. Not 752, merely in the portion that had been allotted to peasant possession. They demanded and obtained credit from the government to buy from the big landowners or former masters. Their land hunger could not be appeased. They remained jealous of the landed aristocrats' very existence. In Russia, as elsewhere in Europe, the rural population was divided into two sharply distinct classes. On the one hand, the peasants of all types who worked the soil, and on the other, the gentry who resided upon it. The two never intermarried. They differed not merely economically, but in speech, dress, and manners, and even in their physical appearances. But in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, the Russian peasants were notably quiet, and older forms of peasant insurrectionism seemingly subsided. The other traditional source of revolutionary disturbance lay among the intelligentsia. Russia's most radical intellectuals and writers, as distinguished from those who were simply liberal or progressive, held a violent contempt for the Russian Empire and yearned for a catastrophic overthrow of the Tsardom. The revolutionary intelligentsia, because there was normally little that they could do, spent their time in vehement discussion and interminable refinement of doctrine. By 1890, the terrorism and nihilism of the 1870s were somewhat passé. The great question was where these willing officers of a revolutionary movement could find an army. Disputation turned upon such topics as whether the peasants or the new factory workers were the true revolutionary class, whether the peasants were potentially proletarian or incurably petty bourgeois, whether Russia was bound to experience the same historical process as the other countries of Europe, or whether it was different, and specifically, whether Russia had to go through capitalism or might simply skip the capitalist stage in reaching the socialist society. The intelligentsia, 1325. Most of the revolutionary intelligentsia were populists. Some continued to approve of terrorism and assassination as morally necessary in an autocratic country. They generally had a mystical faith in the vast inchoate might of the Russian people. And because most Russians were peasants, the populists were interested in peasant problems and peasant welfare. They believed that a great native revolutionary tradition existed in Russia, of which the peasant rebellion of Pugachev in 1773 was the chief example. The populists admired the Mir, in which they saw the European socialist idea of a commune represented. They read and respected Marx and Engels, but they did not believe that an urban proletariat was the only true revolutionary class, or that socialism had to evolve historically out of capitalism. They addressed themselves to the plight of the farmer and the evils of landlordism, favored strengthening the Mir and equalizing the shares of all peasants in it. And because they did not believe that socialism would have to emerge from the prior triumph of capitalism in Russia, they thought that revolution might come quite soon. This populist sentiment crystallized in the founding in 1901 of the Social Revolutionary Party. Populism. Two populists, Plekhanov and Axelrod, fleeing to Switzerland in the 1870s, founded in exile the organization from which the Russian Social Democratic or Marxist Party was to grow. A few Marxists began to declare themselves, though not publicly, in Russia itself. The fact that the peasants in the 1890s were disappointingly quiescent while machine industry, factory labor, and strikes were developing rapidly turned many of the revolutionary intelligentsia, though still only a minority, from populism to Marxism. To Plekhanov and Axelrod were added, as young leaders, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 1870 to 1924, Leon Trotsky, 1879-1940, Joseph V. Stalin, 1879 to 1953, and others. Marxism 1326, of these, it was Lenin who, after Marx, was to be claimed by communism as a theoretical father. Lenin was a short, almost rotund man, 753 with abounding quickness and intense, penetrating gaze. His hair receded in early youth, leaving a massive forehead, behind which a restless mind was inexhaustibly at work. Even in his 20s, he was called the Old One. He was of upper middle class origin, son of an inspector of schools who rose in the civilian bureaucracy to a rank equivalent to Major General. Lenin's boyhood was comfortable and even happy until the age of 17, when his elder brother, a student at St. Petersburg, became somewhat incidentally involved in a plot to assassinate Alexander III, for which he was put to death by order of the Tsar himself. Because of this blot on the family record, it became impossible for Lenin to continue with his law studies. He soon joined the ranks of professional revolutionaries, having no other occupation and living precariously from meager party funds. Lenin 1327, although new industries began to develop in Russia during the early 20th century, most people continued to live and work in the countryside. This picture of peasants harvesting hay around 1900 shows that women performed much of the labor and that workers still used only simple hand tools on Russian farms. Historical Getty Images. 754. Arrested as a revolutionary, he spent 3 years of exile in Siberia. Here, the Tsarist government treated educated political prisoners with an indulgence not later shown by the Soviet regime. Lenin and most of the others lived in cottages of their own or boarded with local residents. No labor was required of them. They borrowed books from Europe, met and visited with one another, debated, played chess, went hunting, and wrote. After his release from Siberian exile, Lenin moved in 1900 to Western Europe, where except for short secret trips to Russia, he remained until 1917. His intellectual vigor, irresistible drive, and shrewdness as a tactician soon made him a force in the party. Genius has been called the faculty for everlasting concentration upon one thing. Lenin, said his 113-28-time close associate Axelrod, for 24 hours of the day is taken up with the revolution, has no thoughts but thoughts of revolution, and even in his sleep dreams of nothing but revolution. Such accounts of his intensely focused activism suggest why and how Lenin would come to lead the Bolshevik Party. In 1898, the Marxists in Russia, spurred on by émigrés, founded the Social Democratic Labor Party. They were not more revolutionary than the larger group of social revolutionaries. They simply had a different conception of the revolution. As good theoretical Marxists, they were more inclined to see the revolution as an international movement, part of the dialectical process of world history in which all countries were involved. They expected the world revolution to break out first in the industrial societies of Western Europe. They particularly admired the German Social Democratic Party, the largest and most flourishing of all the parties that acknowledged the fatherhood of Marx. The Social Democrats. If the Social Democrats were more oriented to Europe than the Social Revolutionaries, it was because so many of their spokesmen lived there in exile. They tended to think that Russia must develop capitalism, an industrialist proletariat, and the modern form of class struggle before there could be any revolution. Seeing in the urban proletariat the true revolutionary class, they looked upon the peasantry with suspicion, ridiculed the mir, and abhorred the social revolutionaries. Like Marx himself, the Russian Marxists disapproved of sporadic terrorism and assassination. For this reason, and because their revolutionary doctrines seemed somewhat academic, the Marxists were for a time actually favored by the Tsarist police, who regarded them as less dangerous than the social revolutionaries. Split in the Social Democrats, Bolsheviks, and Mensheviks. 1329. The Russian Marxists held a second party congress in Brussels and London in 1903. The purpose of the Congress was to unify all Russian Marxism, but in fact it split it forever. The two resulting factions called themselves Bolshevik, or majority, and Menshevik, or minority. Lenin was the main author of the split, and hence the founder of Bolshevism. Although after 1903 it was usually the Mensheviks who had the majority, Lenin clung proudly and stubbornly to the term Bolshevism, with its favorable connotation of a majority in his support. For a number of years after 1903, the Social Democrats remained at least formally a single Marxist party, but they were now irreconcilably divided into two wings. In 1912, the Bolshevik wing organized itself as a separate party. Bolshevism, or Leninism, originally differed from Menshevism, mainly on matters of organization and tactics. Lenin believed that the party should be a small revolutionary elite, a hard core of reliable and zealous workers. Those who favored a larger and more open party, with membership for mere sympathizers, became Mensheviks. Lenin insisted upon a strongly centralized party, 755 without autonomy for national or other component groups. He demanded strong authority at the top, by which the Central Committee would determine the doctrine and control personnel at all levels of the organization. The Mensheviks favored a greater degree of influence by the membership as a whole. Lenin thought that the party would strengthen itself by purges, expelling all who developed deviations of opinion. The Mensheviks, by contrast, came to recommend cooperation with liberals, progressives, and bourgeois Democrats. Lenin regarded such cooperation as purely tactical and temporary. The Mensheviks, in short, came to resemble the Marxists of Western Europe, insofar as that was possible under Russian conditions. Lenin stood for a rigid, exclusionary reaffirmation of Marxian fundamentals, dialectical materialism, and irreconcilable class struggle. Leninism 1330, Lenin accepted and added little to Marx's main governing ideas: that capitalism exploited the workers, that history was shaped by economic forces and was moving toward socialism, that class struggle was the law of society, and that existing forms of religion, government, philosophy, and morals were weapons of the ruling class. He did, however, develop certain theories of imperialism and of the uneven development of capitalism that had been propounded in only general terms by Marx and Engels. According to this Leninist elaboration of earlier Marxist theory, imperialism was exclusively a product of monopoly capitalism, that is, capitalism in its highest and final stage, which develops differently and at different times in each country. The unceasing drive for colonies and markets in a world already almost completely partitioned was leading, inevitably, to international imperialist wars for the redistribution of colonies, as well as to intensified national colonial struggles for independence. Both would provide new revolutionary opportunities for the proletariat, imperialism and development. In other respects, Lenin roundly denounced all who attempted to add anything to the fundamental principles of Marx. Nothing infuriated him so much as revisionist efforts to tone down the class struggle, or hints that Marxism might, in the last analysis, perhaps find 756 or just 156 room for some kind of religion. Lenin was a militant convert who viewed Marxism as a coherent system of historical truth. He found in it a theory of revolution that he accepted without reservation as scientific, and on which he was more outspokenly dogmatic even than Marx himself. His powers of mind, which were great, were spent in demonstrating how the unfolding events of the 20th century confirmed the analysis of the master. 1331, Lenin built the Russian Bolshevik Party into a disciplined revolutionary movement by insisting that a small, centralized elite should make all of the party's key strategic decisions. When the opportunity for revolutionary action finally arrived during the First World War, the Bolsheviks had an effective, centralized political organization, a well-defined Marxist conception of class conflict, and the strong-willed leadership of Lenin, who is shown here addressing a crowd in the spring of 1920. Universal Images Group / Getty Images. Although Leninism contributed little to Marxism as a theory of history, it contributed a great deal to it as a political movement. Lenin was the supreme agitator, a field commander in the class war who could dash off a polemical pamphlet, dominate a party congress, or address throngs of workers with equal ease. Beside him, Marx and Engels seem almost to be reclusive sociologists. Marx and Engels had preferred to believe that the dictatorship of the proletariat, when it came, would represent the wishes of the great majority in a society in which most people had become proletarians. Lenin more frankly foresaw the possibility that the proletarian dictatorship might represent the conscious wishes of a small vanguard and might have to impose itself on great masses by an unshrinking use of force. Lenin as activist war party. Above all, Lenin developed Marx's idea of the role of the party by drawing on his own experience as a revolutionary activist in an autocratic Russian society. The party was an organization in which intellectuals 1332 provided leadership and understanding for workers who could not see so clearly for themselves. For trade unionism, Concerned only with the day-to-day demands of workers, Lenin had even less patience than Marx. The unconscious growth of the labor movement, he wrote, takes the form of trade unionism, and trade unionism signifies the mental enslavement of the workers to the bourgeoisie. The task of intellectuals in the party was to transform the trade unions and the workers into class-conscious revolutionaries. Armed with objective knowledge, the party leadership naturally could not listen to the subjective opinions of others, the passing ideas of laborers, peasants, mistaken party subordinates, or other parties pretending to know more than Marx himself. The idea that intellectuals supply the brains and workers the brawn was understandable as an outgrowth of modern Russian social history, which had created, on the one hand, a highly self-conscious intelligentsia, and on the other, a repressed working class and peasantry deprived of all opportunity for political experience of their own. The insistence on a leading and powerful role for the party elite became one of the most distinctive traits of Leninism and one of the ideas most foreign to the democratic movements in other parts of Europe. The party Leninism accomplished the marriage of Russian revolutionary traditions with the Western European doctrine of Marxism. It was an improbable marriage whose momentous offspring was to be communism. But at the time, when Bolshevism first appeared in 1903, it had little or no effect. When revolution first broke out in Russia in 1905, it took the revolutionary émigrés almost entirely by surprise. 88. The Revolution of 1905, Background and Revolutionary Events. 1333, the almost simultaneous founding at the turn of the century of the Constitutional Democratic, Social Revolutionary, and Social Democratic parties was clearly a sign of mounting discontent. All three parties were essentially propaganda agencies for liberal constitutionalism or for various socialist theories. They had more leaders than followers, and they consisted mainly of intellectuals who argued about different lines of thought. 757. At the same time, however, there were also signs of growing popular unrest. Peasants were trespassing on lands of the gentry and even rising in local insurrections against landlords and tax collectors. Factory workers sporadically refused to work. But with these popular movements, none of the new parties had formed any solid links, in part because there were still no elections in Russia above the provincial Zemstvo level. Growing discontent. The government refused to make concessions of any kind. The Tsar, Nicholas II, who had mounted the throne in 1894, was a man of narrow outlook. Tutored in his youth by the lay leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, he regarded all ideas questioning autocracy, orthodoxy, and great Russian nationalism as un-Russian. For the Tsar, the Tsarina, and their leading advisors, autocracy was the best and only form of government for Russia. The chief minister, Pleve, and the circles at court hoped that a short, successful war with Japan would create more attachment to the government. The war went so badly that its effect was the reverse. Critics of the regime, except for the handful of the most internationalist Marxists, were sufficiently patriotic to be ashamed at the ease with which Russia was defeated by an upstart Asian power. As after the Crimean War, there was a general feeling that the government had exposed its incompetence to all the world. Liberals believed that its secret methods, its immunity to criticism or control, had made it sluggish, obstinate, and 1334 inefficient, unable either to win a war or to lead the economic modernization that was taking place in Russia. But there was little that the liberals could do. Response to military defeat. The police had recently allowed a priest, Father Gapon, to try to organize the St. Petersburg factory workers, hoping thus to counter the propaganda of revolutionaries. Father Gapon took up the workers' grievances in all seriousness. They believed, as uneducated peasants only recently transplanted to the city, that if only they could reach the ear of the Tsar, whom they called the Little Father, he would hear their complaints with shocked surprise and rectify the evils that afflicted Russia. They drew up a petition asking for an 8-hour day, a minimum daily wage of 1 ruble, 50 cents, a repudiation of bungling bureaucrats, and a democratically elected constituent assembly to introduce representative government into the empire. Unarmed, peaceable, respectful, singing "God Save the Tsar," a crowd of 200,000, men, women, and children, gathered before the Tsar's Winter Palace one Sunday in January 1905. But the Tsar was not in the city, and his officials were fearful. Troops marched up and shot down the demonstrators in cold blood, killing several hundred. Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg snapped the moral bond upon which all stable government rests. The horrified workers saw that the Tsar was not their friend. The autocracy stood revealed as the force behind the hated officials, the tax collectors, the landlords, and the owners of the industrial plants. A wave of political strikes broke out. Social Democrats, more Mensheviks than Bolsheviks, appeared from the underground or from exile to give revolutionary direction to these movements. Councils, or Soviets, of workers were formed in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The peasants, too, in many parts of the country spontaneously began to erupt, overrunning the lands of the gentry, burning manor houses, and doing violence to their owners. Social revolutionaries saw opportunities for a radical political upheaval and tried to take over this movement. The 1335 liberal constitutional Democrats, professors, engineers, business people, lawyers, and leaders in the provincial Zemstvos founded 40 years before, tried also to seize leadership or at least use the crisis to force the government's hand. All agreed on one demand, that there should be more democratic representation in the government. Reactions to Bloody Sunday. 758. The angry response to Bloody Sunday in early 1905 erupted in a wave of strikes, demands for political reform, and militant demonstrations, including this protest march in St. Petersburg. Most of the protesters in this photograph were students, and they were marching behind red flags that had become a modern symbol for revolutionary political movements. TASS, Getty Images. The Tsar yielded grudgingly and as little as possible. In March 1905, he promised to call to office men enjoying the confidence of the nation. In August, after a ruinous defeat in the naval battle of Tsushima, he agreed to call a kind of estates general, for which peasants, landowners, and city people should vote as separate classes. Still, the revolution raged unchecked. The St. Petersburg Soviet, or Workers' Council, led mainly by 1336 Mensheviks, Lenin had not yet reached Russia, declared a great general strike in October. Railroads stopped, banks closed, newspapers ceased to appear, and even lawyers refused to go to their offices. The strike spread to other cities and to the peasants. With the government paralyzed, the Tsar issued his October Manifesto. It promised a constitution, civil liberties, and a Duma to be elected by all classes alike, with powers to enact laws and control the administration. The Tsar and his advisors intended to divide the opposition by releasing the October Manifesto, and in this they succeeded. The constitutional Democrats, with a Duma promised, began to hope that social problems could henceforth be dealt with by parliamentary methods. Liberals were now afraid of revolutionaries. Industrialists feared the strength shown by labor in the general strike, and landowners demanded a restoration of order among the peasants. The more militant peasants and workers, however, were not yet satisfied. The former still wanted more land and less taxation. The latter, a shorter working day and a living wage. The several branches of revolutionary intellectuals hoped to carry the 759 popular agitation forward until the Tsarist monarchy was abolished, and a socialist republic was established with themselves at its head. They believed also, and correctly, that the October Manifesto was in any case a deception, which the Tsar would refuse to implement as soon as revolutionary pressure was removed. The Soviets continued to seethe. Local strikes went on, and there were mutinies among soldiers at Kronstadt and sailors in the Black Sea Fleet. The October Manifesto enteiled Reaktivistales, but the government was able to survive and maintain its power. With the middle-class liberals now inactive or demanding order, the authorities arrested the members of the St. Petersburg Soviet. Peace was hastily made with Japan, and reliable troops were recalled from the Far East. The revolutionary leaders fled back to Europe, or again went underground. Or, 1337, were caught and sent to prison or to Siberia. Executions were carried out in the countryside. The revolution of 1905 would prove to be only a dress rehearsal for the revolution to come in 1917. The results of 1905, the Duma. The chief apparent result of the revolution of 1905 was to reorganize Russia's government, at least ostensibly, into a parliamentary system that resembled the governments in other European states. The promised Duma was convoked. For 10 years, from 1906 to 1916, Russia had at least the superficial attributes of a semi-constitutional monarchy. But Nicholas II soon showed that he did not intend to yield much. He drew the teeth of the new Duma before the assembly could even be born by announcing in advance in 1906 that it would have no power over foreign policy, the budget, or government personnel. His attitude toward constitutional monarchy continued until 1917 to be entirely negative. The one concession that Tsarism would not allow was any real participation in government by the public. Within this public, the two extreme fringes were equally impervious to liberal constitutionalism. On the right, stubborn upholders of pure autocracy and the Orthodox Church organized the Black Hundreds, terrorizing the peasantry and urging them to boycott the Duma. On the left, in 1906, the social revolutionaries and both the Bolshevik and Menshevik wings of the Social Democrats likewise refused to recognize the Duma, urged workers to boycott it, and refused to put up any candidates for election. The First Duma. The short-lived First Duma was elected in 1906 by a system of indirect and unequal voting, in which peasants and workers voted as separate classes, and with proportionately far less representation than was granted to the landlords. The socialist boycott and the system of indirect voting gave the liberal constitutional Democrats, the Cadets, a sweeping 1338 majority. The Cadets, when the Duma met, demanded true universal male suffrage and the responsibility of ministers to a parliamentary majority. The Tsar's response was to dismiss the Duma after 2 months. Later Dumas, a second Duma was elected in 1907. The government sought again to control the elections, but because social revolutionaries and Mensheviks now consented to take part, some 83 socialists were elected. The second Duma came to an abrupt end, however, when the government denounced and arrested some 50 socialists as revolutionaries bent only on destruction. A third Duma, elected after an electoral change that gave increased representation to the landed propertied class and guaranteed a conservative majority, managed to hold several sessions between 1907 and 1912, as did a fourth Duma from 1912 to 1916. The deputies, by following the lead of the government and by avoiding the basic question of where supreme power lay, kept precariously alive a modicum of parliamentary institutions in the Tsarist Empire. 760. The Stolypin Reforms. Some officials believed that the way to checkmate the revolutionaries and strengthen the hold of the monarchy was for the government, while keeping all controls in its own hands, to attract the support of moderate people by a program of reforms. One of these reformers was Peter Stolypin, whom the Tsar retained as his principal minister from 1906 to 1911. Stolypin's aim was to build up the propertied classes as friends of the state. He believed, perhaps rightly, that a state actively supported by widespread private property had little to fear from doctrinaire intellectuals, conspirators, and émigrés. He therefore broadened the powers of the provincial Zemstvos, in which the larger landowners took part in administering local affairs. For the peasantry, he put through legislation more sweeping than any since the emancipation, allowing 139 peasants to sell their shares in the communal land of the Mers and leave their villages. Peasants also gained the right to acquire private control over land and to buy property from the communes or the gentry. The Stolypin policy was successful. Between 1907 and 1916, 6.2 million families, out of 16 million who were eligible, applied for legal separation from the Mir. There was no mistaking the trend toward individual property and independent farming. But the results of the Stolypin program must not be exaggerated. The Mir was far from broken. A vast majority of peasants were still involved in the old system of common rights and communal restrictions. The land shortage was still acute in the agricultural areas, where yields were highest. Land hunger and poverty continued in the countryside. There were the new big farmers, the kulaks, to be resented and envied, but the largest landed proprietors were still the traditional gentry. About 30,000 landlords owned nearly 200 million acres of land. Success of the Stolypin program. Stolypin's program provoked widespread opposition. The Tsar gave him only an unwilling support. Reactionary circles disliked his tampering ways and his European orientation. Social revolutionaries cried out against dissolution of the communes. Even Marxists, who should in theory have applauded the advance of capitalism in Russia, feared that Stolypin's reforms might do away with agrarian discontent. Stolypin was shot dead while attending the theater in Kiev, in the presence of the Tsar and Tsarina in 1911. The assassin, a member of the terrorist wing of the Social Revolutionaries, is thought also to have been a secret agent of the reactionary Tsarist police. It may be added that Stolypin's predecessor, Pleve, and about a dozen other high officials within the past few years had similarly died at the hands of assassins. But all in all, despite its violence and repression, the Russian Empire on the eve of the First World War was moving toward the kinds of political and social institutions that had developed earlier in the more industrialized societies of Western Europe. Its industries were growing, its 1,340 railways were expanding, and its exports were half as great in value as those of the United States. It had a parliament, if not a parliamentary government. Private property and individualist capitalism were spreading to new social layers of the population. There was a guarded freedom of the press, illustrated, for example, by the legal and open establishment of the Bolshevik party paper, Pravda, or Truth, in St. Petersburg in 1912. It is not possible to say how far this development might have gone, for it was menaced on both the right and the left by obstinate reactionaries, upholding the absolute tsardom, and by revolutionaries whom nothing but the end of tsardom and wholesale transformation of society could appease. But both extremes were discouraged. The desperation of extreme reactionaries in the government, the feeling that they might soon lose their position, and just perhaps made them the more willing to precipitate a European war by armed support of Serbian nationalists. As for the revolutionary parties, and especially the Bolsheviks, 761, they were losing membership on the eve of the war. Their leaders lived year after year in exile, dreaming of the great days of 1905 and sometimes pessimistically admitting, as Lenin did, that there might be no revolution in their time.